afternoon. My name is John Strope. Welcome to History Nebraska's Brown Bag History Lecture Series. Lectures are held monthly on the third Thursday in the Old Father Family Auditorium here at the Nebraska History Museum here in downtown Lincoln. Learn more about History Nebraska and our programs and services at history.nebraska.gov. If you are not a member of the History Nebraska, I encourage you to join. Your support allows us to provide programs like this Brown Bag History Lecture Series free for all Nebraskans. For a full list of membership benefits, visit our website. Special thanks to the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for the financial support which allows us to tape and broadcast these programs across the state. We'd also like to thank LNK-TV, a service of the City of Lincoln, which produces these programs. If you enjoy today's programs and would like to watch previous Brown Bag lectures, visit the History Nebraska YouTube page at youtube.com/historynebraska. You may remember Jim McKee's talk last September when he did Well-Known Nebraskans You May Never Have Heard Of, Part 1. Our topic today is More Well-Known Nebraskans You May Never Have Heard Of. Our speaker, as I said, is Jim McKee. Jim McKee needs no introduction. He is Lincoln's historian. He is Nebraska's historian. His numerous books, hundreds of articles, and thousands of talks are evidence of the legend. Best of all, Jim McKee is my friend. Just to let you know about asking questions, Jim says to ask them anytime. Please join me in welcoming Jim McKee.
Thank you, John. Well, as you may remember, we titled it Nebraskans You May Never Have Heard Of But Are Well Known. And this time we'll have a couple that I'm sure you will have heard of, but if we go outstate just a little bit, maybe not so much. Some of them you will have recognized, but you won't recognize the names until we get into them a little bit. We're up. Our first person, you may recognize her picture. Her name was Lois Genevieve Krauss, which means zip to anybody, I'm quite sure. And the story starts well before her well-known career. Although Mrs. Jack Atkinson or Harriet Long Stotts were probably the first female pilots in Nebraska, Evelyn Genevieve was one of the earliest and certainly the youngest female pilots in not only Nebraska but the entire United States. Lois Genevieve Krauss was born on October 1st, 1919 in Melstone, Montana, but 2 months later, her then unmarried mother gave her up for adoption to John and Mary Sharp of Kinsey, Montana. They changed her name to Evelyn Genevieve Sharp, a name which you probably do recognize, many of you at any rate. It was not until Evelyn herself was nearly an adult that she discovered that the person she had been referring to her entire life as Aunt Elsie was indeed her mother. Her interest in flying became very early in her life, and her mother realized this fascination for flight and gave her a copy of Amelia Earhart's biography. Her father was quite often involved in just any number of businesses, and finally one of them burned to the ground. And at that time, the family moved from Montana to Hastings, Nebraska. Then in 1924, they acquired a ranch homestead. My gin has arrived. We'll see if it is as ordered. They then moved from Hastings out to a ranch, which they purchased because of the Kincaid Act, which enabled them to take up far more acreage than they would have been able to previously. But the Great Depression interfered. They sold the farm and moved into Ord, Nebraska, where John, the father, started a restaurant and a boarding house, sort of a boarding house hotel concept. One of the Sharps boarders at this boarding house was a man by the name of Jack Jeffords, Jeffords, who was a barnstorming pilot and also a flight instructor in Ord, Nebraska, and also in Broken Bow. In 1934 or 1935, it's not really clear which, Jeffords gave Evelyn a ride in his airplane, and she was hooked. Then Jeffords fell behind in his rent at the boarding house. So he agreed to give Evelyn flying lessons in exchange for his overdue rent. The first lesson was probably February the 4th, 1935, and at that time, Evelyn was 16 years old only. But she managed to solo a few days later on March 4th. Though some records show it was perhaps a year later, it's unclear exactly which is which. While she was still in her senior year, Evelyn received her private pilot's license and became one of the first 5 members of what's known as the Nebraska 99, which is a group of female or women aviators in Nebraska. She was one of the first 5. Evelyn then graduated later from Ord High School in 1937, where she was in the school band, taught swimming, and was voted the most popular woman athlete in the school. At 18, Evelyn earned her commercial license, which enabled her to take passengers in her airplane, and her first passenger was her mother. Jeffords then moved away, which left her and the city without not only a teacher, but also not an airplane. So John, her father, lobbied the businessmen in Ord to get together $600 to buy an airplane. Glenn Auble was the man most responsible for this. They got together the $600 and made a down payment on a Taylor Cub airplane. They promised that they would pay back the merchants in Ord by giving free rides and giving them all the money, and they got enough money to do everything they wanted to. The plane was picked up in Omaha. Evelyn and her father flew back to Ord. Then, when the Grand Island Airport opened, by the way, in 1937, Evelyn became the first person to land at that airport. She then began flying around the country to county fairs, and they advertised her as the youngest aviatrix in the nation. She may or may not have been, we can't be sure, but of course advertising always takes a few liberties. We'll assume that she might have been. Her flights were very, very popular, and before long she claimed to have taken around 3,500 people on airplane rides, and many of these people, this would have been the first ride they ever were in an airplane. She was easily able to repay the $600 to the Ord businessmen almost immediately. In 1938, she came to Lincoln to attend classes at the Lincoln Airplane and Flying School in order to get her transport license, which is the next one above commercial. She may have flown from several airports, if you will, or airfields, more prominent, or more really called fields at that time. But the one she probably used the most, and maybe entirely, was the field which ran from Van Doren Street, where the swimming pool is today, towards the south up to Calvert. And that paralleled 19th Street, and it was about half a block to the west. There's a marker on that field. Of course, it's now covered completely with houses. In 1938, she earned her commercial license, number 34711, becoming the youngest commercial pilot in the world. She obtained a Curtiss Robin OX-5 airplane, which, interestingly enough, had been owned by Wrong-Way Corrigan, which John mentioned just before the program to me. And in May that year, Evelyn flew the first airmail into Ord, Nebraska, and that was the first female airmail pilot in the world. As part of the civil pilot training program, Evelyn began teaching flying then in Spearfish, South Dakota, later moving to Bakersfield, California. She was one of only 10 female pilot instructors in the United States, and within 1 year, she had taught 350 men to fly. When General Hap Arnold formed the WAFS, or the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, Sharpie was one of the first 17 members of that crew, and was a member of the 2nd Flying Group at the Newcastle Army Airfield in Wilmington, Delaware. She went there in October of 1942. The WAFs, or WAFS, were charged with flying aircraft from their manufacturer or remanufacturer, which were mostly on the West Coast, to points on the East Coast before they could be disseminated overseas. But no women ever flew in combat at that time. In 1943, the WAFS merged into the WASPs, which is a more familiar acronym. In April of 1944, she was known as Squadron Commander Sharp, and considered to be one of the most experienced female aviatrix, if that's the plural, I'm not sure. At any rate, one of the most experienced women pilots in the United States. With 3 flights remaining before she would receive her highest rating, she took off in a Lockheed twin-engine P-38 from New Cumberland, Pennsylvania, on a delivery flight which should have ended in California, but almost at once black smoke issued from the aircraft. One of the engines failed, and it was a forced crash landing in which she was killed instantly. Sharpie was buried at Ord Cemetery, which is not far from Ord Airport, which is now named Sharp Field. The airport and the cemetery are on Highway 11, which is now renamed Evelyn Sharp Road. Every June, the community of Ord remembers its most famous daughter, Evelyn Sharp, with Evelyn Sharp Days, and in 1992, Sharpie, or Evelyn, was inaugurated into the Nebraska Aviation Hall of Fame. Went the wrong direction, John. Forewarned, but still screwed it up. Okay. This is a lady that I'm going to guess that none of you have ever heard of. You may have heard of some of the things she did later on, but her name is Fanny Allen, O''Linn. Frances, or Fanny Maria Brainerd, was the daughter of a man by the name of Judge Brainerd, graduated from Iowa State University in 1865, studied law under her father, and then married a physician by the name of Dr. D.H. Olin. That was in 1868. They then moved to Blair, Nebraska in 1872, where Fanny became the principal of the high school there. Her husband became known as one of the finest surgeons in the state of Nebraska. Her husband died in 1880, and at that point, Fanny moved to Tekamah, Nebraska, and became a school principal there. But she immediately saw the great potential and need for settlement in western Nebraska, and in 1884, she took her daughter and her 2 sons and homesteaded near the junction of the White River and Shadron Creek in Sioux County, which is near Dakota Junction in today's Dawes County. Her one-room, 14 by 16-foot cabin claimed to be half dugout and half soddy. She was one of the first settlers in Dawes County and noted that the only houses other than hers in the entire county were at Fort Robinson at that time. Her son Daniel was accidentally killed a short time later, and locals began calling the area around Fanny's cabin Olin in his honor. She applied then for a post office in September of 1884, called the post office Olin as well, and she became the postmaster, keeping the mail in a cracker box. Later, a man by the name of Burr Sheldon opened a general store there, which was followed by a hardware store, a bank, a druggist, and a saloon, some of which operated in tents while their buildings were being built. So the settlement was growing quite quickly. That December, the first Methodist church service in the county, which is known as the White River Olin Charge, was held in her cabin. Early in 1885, it was noted that the village or city of Olin had 500 people, so pretty good size already. 5 saloons and a dozen stores. What else could you possibly need? Thus, when the Elkhorn-Fremont-Missouri Valley Railroad, which we usually think of as the Fremont, Elkhorn, and Missouri Valley Railroad, or FEVR, began scouting the area for right-of-way, Fanny was sure that Olin would be the site of a depot and that the tracks would come through there. Unfortunately, she was a little bit over-optimistic, so she asked the railroad for more money than they were willing to pay, and instead they bought land about 6 miles distant at a place they called Bordeaux, B-O-R-D-E-A-U-X. Bordeaux had a population at that time of 1. A young man who was 25 years old by the name of Mr. Egan, who had started a newspaper there, the Sioux County Journal, and he was very energetically promoting the site as Chadron, Chadron, which was named after Chadron Creek, which was named for a French fur trader whose name was Louis Chartrand. But the people, not knowing how to pronounce it, pretty soon it's known as Chatron and later Chadron. He expressed the name Chadron clearly and pushed it very hard, and the railroad, when they came through there, were willing to accept the name of Chadron, and so the city was born. In the summer of 1885, they were choosing a county seat for what was now Dawson County. Chadron won the site of the county seat. The vote was 582 for Chadron and 3 for Olin. They didn't do too well. Then when the railroad that arrived that July in Chadron, the city of Olin literally picked itself up and moved lock, stock, and barrel, buildings, houses, everything, into Chadron. In fact, it was said that one business actually kept operating while it was being trundled over the prairie. Fanny, too, moved to Chadron and became that city's first postmaster. And no, she was not the postmistress. There is no such thing as a postmistress. The post office still notes that if you're in that title, you are actually a postmaster, whether you're male or female. Dawes County Histories claimed that Fanny Olin was the first woman in Nebraska to be an attorney. Others say she was the second practicing woman attorney in Nebraska. That may well be true, but probably not, because a lady by the name of Ada Bittenbender was admitted to the Nebraska bar in 1882 and was the third woman to be admitted to the U.S. Supreme Court bar. While Olin was not formally admitted to the Nebraska bar until 1885, so her title is a little bit in question. She was, however, the fifth woman to be admitted to the Nebraska bar and the 11th woman admitted to the Supreme Court bar. Whatever her ranking, whether it was first, second, fifth, or 11th, she claims all of those. She was one of the originators of the Nebraska Teachers Association in the Northwest, one of the initial promoters of the Chadron Public Library, and its first postmaster. She was one of the most widely known and widely respected women in the Northwest of Nebraska, present at the first wedding, the first birth, and the first funeral in Dawes County. I think I got it figured out. A man by the name of Lowrey Wimberly, whose name may not come trippingly off your tongue, but you will soon remember him. Lowrey, interesting name, Lowrey Charles Wimberly was born on Christmas Day in 1890 in Louisiana. His father was a Presbyterian and a Methodist minister. The family then moved whenever the church called them, and therefore he attended grade school in North Platte, Nebraska, Juanita, Nebraska, Ogallala, Nebraska, St. Edward, Nebraska, and Woodbine, Iowa. After graduating from high school in Woodbine in 1908, he married a lady by the name of May Boynton in 1910, and then went on to attend Morningside College in Sioux City the following year. In a few years, up to that point, he had worked as a farmhand, a bookkeeper, an accountant, a hotel clerk, stenographer, and a teacher. And he had tried his hand at being a minister as well. His father and his 5 brothers were all ministers, but he quickly determined that this was not his calling. After he graduated from the University of Nebraska with a degree in literature, one of his professors was Louise Pound. In 1918, he studied at Columbia, then returned to Lincoln, where he was admitted to Phi Beta Kappa, and received his PhD here in Lincoln in 1925, and purchased a home at 3201 R Street, not so very far from here. In 1926, Wimberly and several others at the University of Nebraska established the Wordsmith chapter of Sigma Epsilon, which is a literary fraternity. As the group met on a regular basis to discuss their own writing and critique it, in 1926, one of their members, a man by the name of Royce West, came up with the idea of publishing a magazine to compete with a magazine called The Midland at Iowa City. The principal editorial direction would be to publish the work of local, new, or unpublished writers and yet have done with the Beatitudes about the Midwest. Exactly what that means, I don't know, but that was their charge. The concept was universally appealing to the entire group, and Wimberly immediately suggested that their magazine periodical should be called The Covered Wagon. Evidently, someone, either he or the rest of the group, didn't think that title exactly sang, and they substituted the words Prairie Schooner for it. With Wimberly as editor, they quickly attracted submissions from a lady by the name of Marie McCumber. That was her married name, Marie McCumber. She's listed in the city directories as Marie McCumber. She was with the State Historical Society, known as Marie McCumber. But you probably know her as Marie Sandoz. Marie McCumber was her married name. She submitted a piece called The Vine. Best Reader, Aldridge, and others also contributed. University of Nebraska put up $250, enabling them to print 300 copies in 1927, which they sold for 40 cents apiece. They had a lot of contributed funds as well. The authors were paid nothing, but Wimberly was forced to pay the postage, mostly out of his own pocket. So a success in one level, but perhaps not in another. But even as the Prairie Schooner succeeded, Wimberly was very well received by his students, but not very well liked by the faculty. Lauren Isley, a name we do know, was a great fan of Wimberly's and a valued friend, who pointed out he was called the Doc, as his name. He was described by Isley as wearing a dark overcoat and a black Confederate-type slouch hat, and was often morose. Perhaps the ideal professor. On February 13th of 1932, Wimberly and another English professor by the name of Eliason were the chaperones with their wives and 4 others who were not members of the faculty at an all-university dance at the Coliseum. 11:30, after the dance was over, the chaperones were in a closed, locked room, quote, some distance from the dance floor, end of quote, in other words, still in the Coliseum, having a strictly illegal drink. Without warning, the doors were broken open. 2 Lincoln police detectives, a campus policeman, and federal prohibition officers stormed in, confiscated beer, wine, and moonshine whiskey. Wimberly and Eliason were taken into custody and ultimately charged and fined $500 each. That's a considerable amount of money at that point in time. On February the 23rd, the Board of Regents held an inquiry and voted first 3-2 not to demand their resignations, but then on a vote of 4-1, suspended the professors without pay. Reaction was swift from the community and from the other faculty members, and almost all of the publicity was in favor of the professors. One regent then called the arrests a frame-up, or at the very least, a double cross. Dean Charles Oldfather wrote Chancellor Burnett, saying that someone in the administration had obviously tipped off the police. The faculty, they pointed out, and the regents as well, were not immune to the use of alcohol. The net result of all this was that the chancellor's reputation was tarnished, but not Wimberly or Eliason's. In 1953, Wimberly suffered an attack of Parkinson's, which had been undiagnosed for some time, but he continued as editor of the Prairie Schooner until 1956, when Carl Shapiro took over. The Prairie Schooner survived, it prospered, and today is considered one of the finest literary publications of prose and poetry in the United States. Wimberly's favorites included people like Isley and Weldon Keyes, and others were known as Wimberly's Boys. They all succeeded as authors and were said to have published over 1,000 books and articles between them. Just thought we'd revisit Fanny Allen briefly. Okay. The next gentleman, his picture you will not recognize. His name was Ernest, usually called Ernie Cius. Yeah, he was born in Fontenelle, Iowa, at about the time, however, Nebraska Christian Christian University was formed at Bethany Heights, Nebraska. He had worked already as a railroad section hand in a cotton mill, a mule skinner, and sold books door to door. But he graduated from Nebraska Christian University, which by a few years later was better known as Cotner University, and then Cotner College, which is probably how you remember it. When he graduated, he became a pastor immediately and took over a 1,400-member church in Frankfort, Indiana, the Christian church there. Soon he also began a parallel career as a speaker at what we would sort of generally categorize as Chautauqua today. So he was a traveling lecturer. He covered about 2,500 towns on a regular basis, and at the same time, sometimes he would overlap with a man by the name of William Jennings Bryan, who was on the same circuit. About 1910, he removed himself again to the still separate city of Bethany at that point. He lived at 441 East Hiram, which when it came into the city became known as 6934 Aylesworth. Then in 1911, a new South Lincoln church was formed, and a committee met at Cius's home and urged him, in fact he agreed then, to preach at the proposed church, which would be located at 1705 South Street, but for no more than 1 year, because he had many commitments with both the Lyceum and the Chautauqua speaking circuits. They planned to build their new church not at 1705 South, but at roughly 20th and South Streets, and they planned to do it, building it all themselves in 1 day. It didn't work, but by the end of 1 day, they had their, what they called a tabernacle, about 2/3 done, and by Thursday, the church was finished. Cius's 1 year term stretched to 1915, when he was finally forced to retire. Not only that he said he had fulfilled the tabernacle's pulpit, but he delivered some 2,500 lectures in 30 states at that point in time. It was also noted that all available speaking dates for the next 4 years had also been filled, but still, Cius found time to join with two men, Charles Strader and Thomas Anthony, in forming what was known as the Lincoln Auto and Tractor School at 2415 O Street. That was in 1918. It was at that school that not only Charles Lindbergh, but also Evelyn Sharp learned to fly, after they added aircraft to their curriculum in 1920, and then in 1935 became known as the Lincoln Airplane and Flying School. The Lincoln Airplane and Flying School went out of business in July of 1945 after World War II, primarily because they had so efficiently trained so many pilots that after the war came out and wanted to be pilots in commercial aviation, but there was a glut on the market. They closed their doors. They had overtrained too many people. That building is still there. It is an antique mall, 24th, and it's had a lot of tenants since then. Mr. Cius lived on the southwest corner of 27th and Van Dorn. His house is still there. And his name still lives on in the Cius Industrial Tract, which is on the old Union Airport grounds. I'll soon have this figured out, and we'll be done for the day. The Savage brothers. Martin Savage had a ranch about 10 miles southwest of Ewing, Nebraska, in Holt County. And that ranch was always of interest to the people in the county because he was a great inventor. In 1904, Martin established the first telephone connection in the area, connecting his home to Ewing. He also filled his house with labor-saving inventions of his own design. They also had a family band. They had turned their barn into sort of a ballroom, which was a community focus. However, his sons, 7 sons, were the ones that were to give the family their notoriety. Dave, George, Joe, John, Matt, and Philip. Early in the 20th century, the boys entertained themselves by jumping off the barn, jumping out of trees, using their coats as makeshift parachutes. Then on June 13th of 1909, they witnessed a man by the name of Sorensen, who lived in Berwyn, Nebraska, attempt a glider flight, which crashed. However, they developed a lifelong interest in flying at that point. And of course, the Wright brothers had flown December the 17th of 1903 at Kitty Hawk, and further fueled the Savage brothers' imaginations. And Savage is spelled S-A-V-I-D-G-E, not Savage, as you might think. Their father's barn became their workshop, and they first designed gliders in what they called hawk size, in other words, about the size of a hawk. And one of the brothers studied the flight of the hawk scrupulously and thought they could work out a glider based on how the hawk was built. They kept increasing the size of their gliders as they built them until finally they had one large enough that they could accommodate a cat. They put the cat in the glider and flew it, and the cat survived. And that led them to go on build even larger gliders, human-sized. With their father's encouragement, but apparently without any financial help, they ordered parts for a self-designed airplane from Missouri, a $2,000 80 horsepower engine, propeller, and tires came, and they had to build it up from there. So they literally designed it. No matter what they did, they could not get it off the ground. The engine weighed too much. So they set it aside, ordered a lighter engine, and kept going. In the meantime, Nebraska's first airplane flight had occurred in Omaha, but that craft was not built in the state of Nebraska. However, within a year of that same year, that is, Otto, Charles, and Gus Baysdorfer of Omaha did build an Omaha airplane called the Comet. It's difficult to know if the Comet was the first Nebraska-built airplane because the Savages were, even before that, experimenting with these airplanes that they were building and may have actually had one get off the ground. We really don't know. After a test flight, May the 7th of 1911, people came from all over the state of Nebraska to witness it, and the first pilot of their plane was Matt Savage, one of the brothers. After Matt's successful flight, John took over the controls and gave their sister Mary a flight, making her most probably the first female ever to ride in an airplane in the state of Nebraska. Again, we can't prove any of these things. We don't know what was going on elsewhere, but it's publicized as such. Sometime that year, Matt also conceived the idea of buying smoking candles and putting on the tips of the wings so that he was able to write out his name in smoke, making him the first skywriter in the state of Nebraska, if anybody cared at that time. Ever enthusiastic and with their father's contributing support, they set out on a year-long barnstorming tour, which took them throughout the Great Plains. They landed at golf courses, fairgrounds, and parks, and so forth. They would put on flights, take people for flights, and give demonstrations. Then they would disassemble the airplane, put it on a train car, and move it to the next city. Back in Ewing in 1916, the brothers were refining yet another aircraft. And on June the 17th of 1916, Matt took off on an experimental flight. After reaching a height of supposedly 600 to 700 feet, the plane began a spiraling dive. It crashed into the ground, and the engine crashed into Matt, killing him apparently, although the engine was still running. So never did establish exactly what went wrong, but Matt set another record. He became the first person to die in a Nebraska aircraft. The family, however, insisted that the aircraft be disassembled and their flying careers were ended completely. Some of the parts are still stored, supposedly all around the state of Nebraska. The State Historical Society Museum supposedly has, I think, the propeller and possibly the wheel. I'm not just sure what. It hasn't been on display that I know of for quite a while. Supposedly it's here. In 2009, the brothers were all installed in the Nebraska Aviation Hall of Fame, and at that time, their descendants claimed that they would have beat the Wright brothers if only their father had been willing to finance them. Well, who knows? Bayard Lewis Payne was born in Rutland, Ohio in 1851, and very little is known of his early life. But in 1875, he graduated from the Ohio Medical College. He then took further training at the Hanneman College in Philadelphia and began practicing in Portsmouth, Ohio in 1877. And the following year, 1878, he arrived in Lincoln, Dr. Payne. He was a homeopathic physician. Homeopathy is a little, if at all, used anymore method of curing diseases by using very tiny quantities of medicines. Don't know, but I don't think it's used much, if at all, anymore. Payne's office was located in the Union Block, which was on the southwest corner of 10th and O Street, and he lived in the Commercial Hotel, which would later become the site of the Capitol Hotel, which is now a downtown apartment building on 11th and P Streets. About the same time, 1880, a man by the name of J.E. Miller was a clerk in the Winger, W-I-N-G-E-R, dry goods company, which was just moving from the north side of P Street to O Street between 11th and 12th. Now, the Wingers were not just dry goods merchants, but the Wingers also, and with their new partners, were building a building, occupying it with a dry goods store, and then immediately, as soon as they occupied it, they would begin building another store, usually a little bit larger, and usually within about a 2 or 3 block area. Then both buildings would be put up for sale. Whichever one didn't sell, they would keep their dry goods store in, and they would keep building and moving and building and moving. It was also the same time that Dr. Payne and Mr. Miller became acquainted. Mr. Payne, or Dr. Payne, was also quite involved with St. Paul Methodist Church, which at that time was known as First Methodist Church. It'll become St. Paul Methodist Church, 1881-1882. He was also elected the president of the YMCA, and he will buy a house which was on the northeast corner of 13th and P Streets, and give it to the YMCA, and that became their new site, which many of you remember was the YMCA until it was torn down to build, first of all, a movie theater, two or three movie theater complex, and now it's the site of the park. At any rate, in 1886, Dr. Payne purchased a home at 1125 N Street, which he put on the south side of N, sort of in the middle of the block. The house was set back from N Street and existed there for decades after the rest of the block even grew up. And at the same time, a man by the name of John Miller, we talked about him earlier, he bought out Mr. Winger. And he renamed the business the Miller Wholesale and Retail Dry Goods Store, which was then located at 145 South 10th. And if you try to trace where they were located when, you actually can't even use the city directories, because sometimes they would move twice within 1 year. So it really is very, very difficult to trace them. But at that time, they were located right next to another company called the Hardy Furniture Company. 3 years later, the Miller, now called the Miller Dry Goods and Fancy Goods Company, had moved yet again, and they were at 133 South 11th. And they wanted to move again, and they wanted to expand, and this time they wanted to do it in a big way, but they needed a lot of extra capital. His first request was turned down, and then John Miller approached Dr. Payne. Dr. Payne, in the meantime, had successfully taken on a partner, Dr. Link, but Payne had been watching Mr. Miller and was convinced that he was an honest merchant and would have increasing success. The result was Dr. Payne becoming the vice president of a new firm called Miller and Payne, which all of you recognize. The physicians, Payne and Link, then moved again to 225 South 12th, and they got the latest invention in town, a telephone. Their telephone number was 9. So you could easily remember that one for sure. Dr. Payne was never more than a silent partner in Miller and Payne. Dr. Payne had also owned a dry goods store himself briefly on O Street between 12th and 13th, Payne Dry Goods. But he began taking up another interest on the side as well. Actually, 2 interests, politics and prohibition. August 29 of 1880, Dr. Payne became the Prohibition Party's nominee for governor. And at the same time, and on the same ballot, there was a prohibition amendment. On the same ticket was Mr. Hardy, H.W. Hardy. He was running for state treasurer, and he was a very strong proponent of prohibition as well. However, there was strong opposition from the Democratic Party. Payne was defeated. He received 3,676 votes. And to give you an idea of how badly he was defeated, the Prohibition Amendment failed, 111,728 to 82,292. In other words, he got from 200,000 potential votes, he got 3,676. So as a politician, I would have to say he did not do well. Interesting, at the same time, William Jennings Bryan, who was later nominated for the presidency by the Prohibition Party, back in 1890, he decided that he would not run in opposition to the amendment because he didn't think it would be successful. He was right. Meantime, there was a statewide meeting at St. Paul Church, which brought all of the Methodist educational facilities in the state of Nebraska together to create Nebraska Wesleyan University at the separate city of University Place, Nebraska. The story is often told, and it may be apocryphal. That will not keep me from telling it. It was said that Dr. Payne said he would give $1,000 to Nebraska Wesleyan if they would put the school no more than 3 miles from his department store at 13th and Elm. They wanted to raise $50,000, so $1,000 is a pretty good amount of money. And it was said that when they discovered that they were a few feet away from the 3-mile limit, they picked up the plans and moved them to the site of where we have Old Main and Nebraska Wesleyan today. 50 feet is away is all they moved it. Now, is it true or not? I don't know. It's a good story. Whether it's true or not, Dr. Payne became a great friend of Nebraska Wesleyan. And in 1901, when they were trying to remove all of their debt, he pledged another $1,000. Dr. Payne died in 1921. St. Paul shared the bulk of his estate with Wesleyan. And his will, it was stated, read like an organizational chart of the state. In 1957, which is now quite a ways away, but not so far away in my memory at least, that he was at that time St. Paul Church's greatest benefactor. Several of his funds still exist today. I believe it's a music fund and some other things. And there's one room in the church called the Payne Parlor. And anybody who's ever heard me talk about Dr. Payne always remembers that I always think Dr. Payne gave up an obvious opportunity. When you have a name like Payne and you are a physician, it seems like you should have capitalized on it and started a clinic, Payne Clinic, right? Now, in order to do that, you would hire some other physicians to work with you. For a surgeon, you could hire Dr. Carveth. Then when Dr. Carveth was done, you would have another surgeon standing by, Dr. Stitcher. You might even bring in an ophthalmologist, Dr. Lookabout. If you went as far as Seward, you could bring in a podiatrist by the name of Dr. Foote. And there's lots of others, you can fill in some yourself, but in order to have a complete clinic, you would also want to hire the physician who was the director of the Nebraska Wesleyan Hospital, whose name was Dr. Coffin. So, at any rate, that never came about. There's a man you don't recognize most probably by his picture, another minister by the name of Reverend Moses Shin. He was born in Ohio in 1809, the first white child to be born in the entire area, and at the age of 15, he moved to Kentucky, where he learned the trade of tailoring. While he was living in Kentucky, it is said he gave a common sense remedy to a man who was suffering but quickly recovered. The word spread of his recuperation, and Mr. Shin became known for being a healer or a doctor. He did nothing to discourage this. When he married, he took up his wife's religion as a Methodist. In about 1830, he was issued a license to exhort, and 8 years later became a Methodist minister. I've got to find out exactly sometime what it means to have a license to exhort, but it has something to do with being a minister at any rate. He spent about a decade moving around the state of Iowa and established several Methodist churches there. In 1850, he was in Council Bluffs. And while he was there in the process of establishing yet another Methodist church, a story is often told, again perhaps apocryphal, that he rather brazenly entered the Ocean Wave Saloon in Council Bluffs and approached a group of gamblers, and with no hesitation said to them that he heard, in fact, that they were a generous group of men. He asked each one of them to give him a $20 gold piece to establish his church. 8 of the men complied. Pretty good record. In 1855, Shin crossed the river into Omaha, where he continued to preach and aided the establishment of several more Methodist churches in Nebraska. Also in 1855, this is territorial days, of course, he, along with a number of other men, established in Omaha Simpson University, chartered by the territorial legislature. He had an interest in all sorts of things. He bought a quarter of a section of land northwest of downtown Omaha, some of which he sold as residential property, setting aside 10 acres for Mount Prospect, which was Omaha's first cemetery. The cemetery was later purchased by Byron Reed, who added more land, and it became known as Forest Lawn Cemetery, which exists to this day. In 1858, the legislature established a city called Mahala. It existed only on paper, and it was the county seat of Butler County. There was absolutely nothing there, but it was the county seat. A year later, Moses Shin arrived in the still unorganized county and bought land and formed a little town he called Savannah. It was on the north boundary of Butler County on the south side of the Platte River. The county did organize in 1868, and Shin, of course, lobbied greatly for Savannah becoming the county seat, which it did. Within a short period of time, there was a courthouse, a hotel, 2 general stores, a blacksmith, and a dozen other businesses were going. Unfortunately, it was on the edge of the county, and county seats on the edge of counties do not work very well. The primary reason being people were traveling at a rate of about 2.5 miles an hour, and it was thought to be a great advantage to have the county seat located at the dead center of the county. So we find across Nebraska, virtually, not every, but virtually every county's county seat has been moved to the center. The one that we would be most familiar with here would be when Ashland was the county seat of the county Saunders, and it moved to Wahoo. And if you look at a map of Lancaster County, there's actually a little dip, and Ashland is clear in the corner, almost entirely in Lancaster County. So these things made a great deal of sense. 2.5 miles an hour meant that you would be able to get to do business in the county seat much quicker. So in 1873, the county seat was moved from Savannah to a city then known as David's, with an S, city. Later, it became known as David City, originally David City. One of the actions, as soon as it was named the county seat, was to pick up the courthouse physically in Savannah and virtually all of the other businesses and move them to David City. When the courthouse was first moved, for a good long time, that was the only building in David City. Savannah itself withered, went away. There's nothing there at all anymore. Meanwhile, Mr. Shin sees the advantage of a spot on the Platte River as an obvious ferry location. Now, most of the immigrants moving from Omaha towards the west at that time, and I say from Omaha, but basically from the Missouri River, kept to the north side of the Platte River, which was the Mormon Trail. But when that trail came into Colfax County, which was directly across the river from Butler County, it became advantageous at that point to cross the river and avoid a number of creek crossings, which they would have had to have made on the north side of the Platte. There, about a mile east of the village of Savannah, Shin proposed to build a ferry. He contracted with a man by the name of Richard McMurray. He said, "I will build and pay for the ferry, finance the entire operation, and you will keep 1/3 of the net profits if you operate the ferry for me." The fee for driving a wagon or walking stock across the river was $2.50 for a wagon or walking stock. That's a very expensive crossing. And yet it became very popular, even though at Fort Kearney they could cross at a ford for free, but it was very, very popular. Then with the discovery of gold at Pikes Peak in Colorado, travel along the trail increased. Mr. Shinn became wealthy. He, meantime, however, continued to preach as a Methodist to everyone on the trail, and it was said he reaped or would reap many sly dollars in interspersing among his sermons well-turned advertisements holding up the advantage of Shinn's ferry over the Columbus Institution. The ferry was very successful and continued operating until 1865, when two would-be thieves stole the ferry boat, and it went down, capsizing. With them, the ferry was lost, and the two thieves were lost at the same time. So the next year it was rebuilt, not by Mr. Shinn. It was still known as Shinn's Ferry. They dropped the fees from $2.50 to $1.50, but other bridges were being built, other ferries were being built. Mr. Shinn is out of that business by then. He returns to Omaha, and he builds the Second Methodist Church there at 23rd and Izard, and continues pursuing his real estate interests. His biographer at that time noted that he preaches in the forenoon, visits immigrants after dining, figures up in the evening, paddles his canoe all week, and swaps horses on Saturday evening. When Moses Shinn died in 1885, he was noted as being one of the richest men in Omaha. Once worth over $250,000. At his death, probably worth more like $50,000 because he was over generous. Where was he buried? Prospect Hill Cemetery, of course. Got a few minutes and we'll talk briefly about this gentleman, Alvin Saunders Johnson. A man by the name of Jensen Derup, D-E-Y-R-U-P, immigrated from Denmark to Wayne County of Nebraska, and he cleverly got the immigration officers to change his name from a name I can't even pronounce to one I can, John Johnson. And since he was Denmark, you might have thought it would have been Johnson E-N, but it was Johnson O-N. He built a log cabin near the village of Homer, and with a nod to the territorial Nebraska governor of Alvin Saunders, named his son Alvin Saunders Johnson. At age 3, his mother began to teach him to read. He was a bit gangly and buck-legged, and he drew the nickname of Professor Fogg. 1892, he decided to enter the University of Nebraska, but when he arrived, it was November. Classes had started in September, so he went to the registrar, Ellen Smith, and she said, come back next year and come back in September. Mr. Johnson simply went across the street and went directly to the chancellor, Chancellor Canfield. He was interviewed by him and was admitted 2 months late. This really irritated Miss Smith, and she set out to give him the hardest professors that he could find for him, including a man by the name of Lieutenant John J. Pershing, who was teaching math and well known as a very strict disciplinarian. Mr. Pershing was commandant of cadets and also attending law school at that time. Johnson entered as pre-med, but decided instead to get his degree in classics, got his bachelor's degree in 1897, then his master's degree. His classmates included Dorothy Canfield, Willa Cather, and Louise Pound. He mentioned that he thought Louise was actually more intelligent than her brother Roscoe, which is quite something. 1902, he finished his economics degree in economics and became the first editor of the Political Science Quarterly. He began teaching at the University of Texas. He didn't stay long, came back to the University of Nebraska very briefly, but said that Nebraska was ruled by puritanical rules and was becoming too conservative. So he went to Columbia, started the New Republic. In 1918, he, along with several others, established the New School University. He also brought 184 Jewish scholars to the United States, a list which is later referred to as Johnson's Schindler's List. New School flourished. Bob Carey was the head of it from 2000 to 2011. He retired in 1945 and died in 1971. In the end, He had taught at Bryn Mawr, University of Nebraska, Columbia University of Texas, University of Chicago, Stanford, and Cornell. He had written nearly 1,000 articles and books, much of the 8-volume 1927 Encyclopedia of Social Sciences, with honorary degrees given to him by Brandeis University of Nebraska, Hebrew Union, Yeshiva University, and universities in Brussels, Algiers, and Heidelberg. It was said that New School accommodated more economic emigres than any other in the United States. Alvin Saunders was at that time noted as being, and I love this quote, the last man who knew everything there was to know. He was formally introduced into Nebraska Hall of Fame in 2014, and I think that is almost exactly 60 minutes. So if there are any questions, we'll entertain them after we close off. Thank you.